Hey, imagine this. You wake up one morning, look out your window, and find out your entire town is about to disappear underwater. This isn't a movie. This actually happened in Canada. There are 6 complete towns at the bottom of Canadian lakes. Houses, schools, churches, everything's still down there, preserved, frozen in time. Over 6,500 people were forced to abandon everything in just 2 years. And here's the creepiest part. Some of them came back years later, as scuba divers, to swim through the streets where they grew up. Stick around till the end because the last town will give you chills. Nobody believed it would actually be flooded until they opened the floodgates. So let's dive into these 6 submerged towns. But first, just do me a quick favor and check if you're already subscribed to the channel. Why? Because in the upcoming videos, I'm bringing you more stories like this. Places the world forgot. Ghost towns, abandoned villages with stories that sound like movies, but they're real. If you're into this kind of content, you don't want to miss what's coming. Sound good? Hit that subscribe button and let's discover what happened. Alright, so to really understand this whole story, we need to go back in time. We're talking the early 1950s. Back then, Canada and the United States had this grand idea. They wanted to create a massive water highway, the St. Lawrence Seaway. You know those huge cargo ships? Well, they wanted those ships to be able to travel from the Atlantic Ocean all the way into the heart of North America, through the Great Lakes. It was like building a highway, except made of water. And it was going to revolutionize trade, create jobs, bring in money. Everyone thought it was brilliant. There was just one little problem. Actually, a pretty big problem. To make this seaway work, they needed to flood a massive area. And in that area, thousands of people were living, in 9 different villages, with their homes, their farms, their businesses, their memories. And then the government showed up and said, "Look, we need this space. You've got to leave." They called it Operation Submerge. What a name, right? Straight to the point. No beating around the bush. Now let me tell you about the first of these towns. Town 6, Aultsville. Aultsville was founded way back in 1787 by a guy named Captain George Ault. He was a British loyalist, one of those people who fled the United States after the American Revolution because they wanted to stay loyal to the British crown. And look, Aultsville wasn't just some tiny village. It was thriving. Over 500 people lived there. Just to give you an idea, it had schools, a post office, several hotels, all kinds of shops. And you know what else? It had a cheese factory that was famous throughout the entire region. People would come from far away just to buy Aultsville cheese. It was one of those small towns where everyone knew everyone, but it had life, movement, commerce happening. Imagine living in a town like that. Your grandparents lived there. Your parents were born there. You grew up there. Your kids were growing up there. And then one day in 1956, a government representative knocks on your door. He sits down at your kitchen table, accepts a cup of coffee and says, "Look, I've got some bad news. Your town is going to be flooded. You've got 2 years to get out." 2 years. Sounds like a lot of time, right? But it's not. Not when you have to decide what to take from an entire lifetime. Not when you have to sell your house, knowing nobody's going to want to buy a house that's going to end up at the bottom of a lake. Not when you have to say goodbye to everything you know. The residents of Aultsville were in shock. People were crying in the streets. Families refused to believe it. "They're not really going to do this," they'd say. "They'll change their minds." But they didn't. And you know what's even sadder? Some houses were too old, too fragile to be moved. So they just stayed, waiting for the water to rise. Town 5, Mille Roches. Now, the second town on our list has a beautiful name, Mille Roches. In French, it means 1,000 rocks, and the name made total sense. The town sat in an area filled with gorgeous rock formations along the banks of the St. Lawrence River. It was one of those breathtaking places. You know when you look at a landscape and think, "Man, how is this so beautiful?" That was it. Mille Roches had about 400 residents. It was smaller than Aultsville, but just as special. People took immense pride in living there. It was a tight-knit community where everyone literally knew each other. But when news of the flooding arrived, something surreal started happening. The government offered help to move the houses. But it wasn't like you just load the furniture onto a truck and you're done. No. They literally cut the houses in half. You heard that right. Entire houses being sawed, split into two parts, loaded onto massive trucks, and hauled to new plots in neighboring towns. Picture the scene. You're standing there in the street, watching the house where you were born being cut in half with a giant saw. One half goes on one truck, the other half goes on another, and you're standing there thinking, is this really happening? There are photos from that time, and man, they're heartbreaking. You see houses literally in the middle of the road being transported, walls cut open, rooms exposed, like someone had opened up a giant dollhouse. Some families managed to put the two halves back together in the new town. Others, well, some halves just got lost in the process, became firewood, became nothing. And here's a detail most people don't know. Not everyone accepted the help. Some residents said, "If I can't have my house in Mille Roches, I don't want it anywhere." And those people, they left everything behind, just walked away and started over from scratch somewhere else. Try to imagine the courage or the desperation it takes to do that. Hold on, pause with me for a second here. Can you really imagine that? Like, stop and think about it. You get the news that your entire town is going to disappear underwater. The house where you grew up, your kids' school, the playground where you used to play, the corner store where you'd buy bread every day and the owner knew you by name. All of it, gone. How would you react? Would you fight it? Would you accept it and try to start over? Would you stay until the very last second? Drop a comment and tell me what you think you'd do in that situation. And if you know any similar stories of someone who had to abandon their home, their town, because of some government project, share that with us too. I read all the comments and I'll reply to you. Now come with me because the story gets even more intense. All right, now we're going to learn about 3 more towns that disappeared. And look, each one has a story that makes you think about what home really means. Town 4, Farren's Point. Farren's Point was old. We're talking late 1700s, founded around 1784. Just to put that in perspective, when this town was created, the United States had just become independent. George Washington was still alive. Brazil was still a Portuguese colony. This town saw a lot of history go by. It was a super important stop for travelers. You know those towns that are right in the middle of the route and everyone stops there? Exactly. It had inns, places to eat, and even a historic lighthouse that guided navigators along the river. And when I say historic lighthouse, I don't mean just any little lighthouse. This lighthouse had helped save hundreds of vessels over the years. It was like a symbol of safety, of hope. When navigators saw that light, they knew, we're safe, we've reached Farren's Point. But in 1958, that same lighthouse was about to witness something completely different. On the day of the flooding, I'll tell you the details about that date later, I promise. The residents of Farren's Point did something that gives me chills to this day. They gathered in the local church. The same church where generations upon generations had been baptized, married, mourned, and they held one final ceremony. It wasn't a regular service. It was like a farewell, a funeral, except not for a person, for an entire town. There are accounts that the priest was crying while he spoke, that people were hugging each other and crying together, that children were asking their parents, "Why is everyone sad? Aren't we coming back?" And the parents didn't know what to say, because how do you explain to a 6-7-year-old kid that the playground where they play every day is going to be under 100 feet of water, that grandma's house is going to become a fish habitat? After the ceremony, people walked out of the church, looked at the town one last time, and left. Some never came back. Not by boat, not to dive. It was too painful. Town 3, Maple Grove. Now, if Farren's Point was historic, Maple Grove was cozy. It was a small village, only about 150 residents, mostly farming families. And the name says it all, Maple Grove. The town was surrounded by maple trees. You know, the ones that give Canada its famous syrup. In the fall, it became a spectacular display of colors. Red, orange, yellow. It looked like a painting. People there lived simply. They planted, harvested, sold in the neighboring town. Weekends there were church gatherings, kids running through the fields, that quiet country life. And you know what I think is most beautiful about Maple Grove? How united the people were. When the flooding news arrived, the families got together and made a pact. If we have to leave here, we leave together. They literally chose a new town and moved as a group, like they bought plots of land next to each other, rebuilt the community in another place. Obviously, it wasn't the same. It never would be. But at least they had each other. Now, there's a part of this story that's heavy, really heavy. Maple Grove had a cemetery, an old cemetery with graves of pioneers, of founding families of the region, people who had been buried there over 100 years ago. And the government said, look, we can't let the cemetery get flooded. You're going to have to exhume the bodies. Exhume. Dig up. Imagine having to do that, having to open your grandfather's grave, your great-grandfather's grave, put the remains in a new box and take them somewhere else. Some families couldn't handle it. They paid other people to do it because it was too traumatic. And there were even cases of people who refused. My father was buried here. He's staying here. And they just left, leaving the graves behind. Today, at the bottom of the lake, there are still gravestones. Some standing, others fallen, covered in algae. It's like an underwater cemetery. Divers have reported seeing it, and they say it's one of the creepiest things they've ever seen underwater. Town 2, Wales. The second town was called Wales, and the name wasn't random. It was founded by Welsh immigrants in the early 1800s. These people came from across the Atlantic, crossed the ocean in rickety ships, arrived in Canada and said, this is it. This is where we're going to rebuild our lives. And they built a strong community, with Welsh traditions, with the Welsh language being spoken at home, with traditional festivals, with traditional foods. Wales had about 300 residents at the time of the flooding, and they were very proud of their roots. There was even a church where the service was conducted partly in English, partly in Welsh, to keep the tradition alive, to not forget where they came from. But then came the flooding news, and man, the outrage was real, because these people had crossed an ocean to build this. They'd sweated blood to turn that land into productive farms. They'd raised children, buried parents, built a life there. And now someone showed up and said, sorry, but you got to leave. It's for the greater good. Greater good for who? That was the question that echoed, but there was no way around it. They had to leave. And you know what's crazy? Today, divers still find things in Wales. Personal items, dishes, tools, children's toys. One diver found a porcelain doll intact inside a submerged house. He said it was one of the saddest things he's ever seen. Because you imagine, that doll was loved by some child. It had a name. It was hugged, rocked, taken everywhere. And on moving day, it was probably forgotten, or left behind on purpose because it didn't fit in the move, or because the child was so traumatized they didn't care about toys anymore. And now it's down there, at the bottom of the lake, in the dark, alone. These towns' stories really get to you, don't they? But wait, because we still have the most shocking one of all. All right, so now we're getting to the last town. And look, this one hit me the hardest when I was researching for this video. It's a story that'll give you chills. But before that, I noticed something. You still haven't left a like on this video. So go ahead, click that thumbs up down there. Good? All right then, let's get to the most shocking story of them all. Town 1, Dickinson's Landing. If all the towns I've told you about so far were important, Dickinson's Landing was the town, the biggest, the busiest, the one that nobody believed would actually be flooded. It had over 700 residents. For the time and region, that was a lot of people. It was like the local metropolis. And it wasn't just the size. It was what was inside. It had stores for everything you can imagine. Butcher shop, bakery, pharmacy, hardware store, fabric store. It had a bank. It had a lawyer's office. It had a doctor. It had a dentist. It had a super busy train station. Every day people were arriving, leaving. Merchandise was coming in, going out. It was a commercial hub, a connection center. And you know what else? It had life. It had 2 movie theaters. 2 in a town of 700 people. It had a dance hall, restaurants, even a famous ice cream parlor where teenagers would hang out. Dickinson's Landing wasn't just any small town. It was a vibrant town, with a history spanning over 170 years, since the 1780s. So when the government announced it would be flooded, the reaction was like, yeah, very funny. Now seriously. But they were being serious. The resistance. At first, a lot of people simply didn't believe it. They're not going to flood Dickinson's Landing. It's too big. It's too important. They'll change the project. Petitions started circulating. Residents organized, held protests, wrote letters to politicians, tried everything. One shop owner said, "My father built this business with his own hands. My grandfather opened the first version of this store in 1820. I grew up here. My kids grew up here. And you want me to just abandon it? Why? So ships can pass through?" The outrage was real and understandable. But the project was too big. There was too much money involved, too much political interest. And at the end of the day, the government didn't change its mind. And that's when the real nightmare began. The preparation. Starting in 1956, Dickinson's Landing entered a kind of bizarre limbo. New businesses stopped opening. Who was going to invest in a town that was going to be flooded? Houses stopped being renovated. Why paint the walls if in a year it's going to be underwater? People started leaving gradually. First those who had money to move, then those who managed to sell their properties, even if for ridiculously low prices. Then those who simply gave up fighting. The town started dying before the water even arrived. Stores closed. The movie theater closed. The train station became emptier and emptier. The streets that used to be full of life started becoming silent. And there are reports that it was scary, like a real ghost town. You'd walk down the street and see abandoned houses, broken windows, open doors swinging in the wind, objects left behind because they didn't fit in the move. One resident described it like this: "It was like the town was bleeding out. Every day more people left, more houses became empty. It was like watching someone die slowly." The day of the flooding, July 1st, 1958. And then the day came, July 1st, 1958. Ironically, July 1st is Canada Day, Canada's Independence Day, a day of celebration. But for over 6,500 people, that day was one of mourning. At 8 in the morning, the dam floodgates were opened. At first, nothing too dramatic happened. The water started rising slowly, like you'd look and couldn't even notice much difference. But it didn't stop rising. Some families who had stayed until the last moment went to watch. From a distance, from safe places, they watched. First, the water covered the lower streets. Then it started entering the houses. First, just the basement, then the first floor. Then, it took weeks for the towns to completely disappear. And you know what's even more surreal? Some people came back by boat during the flooding. They'd row through the streets where they grew up, except now those streets were underwater. They'd pass over the rooftops of houses. They'd look through the second-floor windows and see the submerged rooms. One man told the story of how he came back by boat and passed by the house where he was born. He said he could see, through the water, the kitchen where his mother used to cook, the living room where the family gathered, and he just sat there, still in the boat, crying. Because that wasn't a house anymore. It was a tomb.
The legacy today.
Today, these 9 communities, including the 6 I've told you about, are known as the Lost Villages.
There's a museum dedicated to them. It has photos, rescued objects, preserved stories. And every year on the anniversary of the flooding, survivors and descendants gather there.
They're elderly people now, many in their 70s, 80s, 90s, who were children or teenagers when it all happened. And they tell the stories. I lived on Main Street in Aultsville. My father had a store in Dickinson's Landing. I went to school in Mille Roches. There's also a memorial, with the names of all the destroyed communities, and a phrase that gives me chills. They gave up their homes so a nation could prosper. But the most fascinating part? What's happening underwater? Nowadays, divers explore the ruins. And man, it's like diving into a time machine. The structures are still there. House walls, building foundations, sidewalks, roads. You can see the layout of the streets at the bottom of the lake. There are trees that were flooded and remained preserved underwater. There are personal items, bottles, dishes, tools. One diver said he found a street sign. It was covered in algae, but you could still read, Main Street, Dickinson's Landing. He took a photo and posted it online. And in the comments, an 85-year-old woman appeared saying, "I lived on that street." Number 47. There was an apple tree in front of my house. I wonder if it's still there. And the diver went back. He searched and found it. A dead tree, preserved by the cold water, in front of what remained of the foundation of house number 47. He sent photos to the woman. She cried. Echoes of the past. But there's something that happens that sounds like a movie. In years of extreme drought, when there's very little rain and the lake levels drop significantly, some structures start to emerge. That's right. Parts of the towns become visible again. It happened in 2007. It happened in 2012. And it happened again in 2020. And when that happens, people go there. Elderly folks who lived in those towns come back. They walk through the ruins. They try to find where their house was. One old man found the staircase of the house where he grew up. He sat down right there, on the same step where he used to sit when he was 10 years old, and just stayed there. For hours, just remembering. One woman found the foundation of the church where she got married in 1957. She came back with her husband, both over 90 years old, and they held hands in the place where they'd pledged eternal love almost 70 years before. But then the rain comes back. The water level rises again, and the towns disappear once more. It's like a cycle. They appear, like ghosts visiting the world of the living, and then return to the depths. The question that remains. And so the question remains, right? Was it worth it? The Seaway was built. It brought economic development. It created jobs. It facilitated trade. It helped the economies of Canada and the United States grow. But it cost 9 communities. Over 6,500 uprooted lives. 200 years of history erased in weeks. Was it progress? Was it necessary? Or was it too much of a sacrifice? There's no right answer. It depends on who you ask. If you ask an economist, they'll show you graphs of GDP growth. If you ask someone who lost their home, their town, their life there, the answer will be very different. And that's the story of the 6, actually 9, lost towns of Canada. Towns that are still there, at the bottom of the lake, silent, dark, waiting. Waiting for what? Nobody knows. Maybe waiting for us not to forget them. So that's it. Do you think what they did to these people was fair? Would you have done things differently if you were in charge? Or do you think there was no other option? I really want to hear your opinion, and I promise I'll read it and respond. And look, thank you so much for watching until the end. And if still not subscribed, man, subscribe now. Hit that red button, because there's a lot coming. Already researching next videos. Ideas about haunted places in Canada, unsolved mysteries of Ontario, Canadian urban legends, forbidden places no one can visit, real survival stories in Canadian wilderness, and much more. Ton of incredible content coming. Turn on bell to receive all notifications. Stay on top of everything. And if you want to go beyond, support channel more directly, become channel member and receive exclusive content. See you next video.